Good morning, magical beings. How you all doing? All right. So, second day of Portal is getting started. Yesterday, we turned into trees and we started to explore the roots and the vines. And the theme of Friday was roots. And Mika kicked us off with exploring the ancient origins of Larp. And also we have the exhibition about the Alliance of the Known Realms, about the Hungarian tradition of summer camps, fantasy summer camps. It's still on. It's going to be available for your enjoyment throughout the entire weekend in the cellar in the King's Grove. And today we will be focusing on the vines, all of the climbers and all of the branches that are connecting role-playing, live-action role-playing to other forms of participative storytelling. And not just that, to other worlds, to things like LARP in education, and how to use LARP in business, and all kinds of other different realms are going to be connecting today. So that is going to be our theme for Vines, and that theme is going to be kicked off by David Bassuk from the US, coming to us straight from his busy trip all over Europe, straight from Salzburg, if I'm not mistaken. David is a theater person, a theater director from the US, but he is one of the most knowledgeable people that I know about transmedia and immersive experiences, and he's going to give today's keynote speech. So, David, I think I talked enough. Yeah, take it away.
Thank you, Nando. Thank you, everyone. So thank you for your introduction. Thank you for inviting me here. It seems not that long ago that I was merely LARP curious. And I'll tell a quick story. So, I was teaching a class called Gameplay and Performance, but I didn't quite appreciate the meaning of LARP. But in my class, which was, once I announced it, it filled immediately to everyone's surprise because it was a brand new course and an elective not required. But such is the power of game, certainly on a college campus where there were no classes in game other than a mathematics class, which was pretty dry. And in my class, there was a very large group of students who had a LARP club on campus and were very interested in this class as a way to help support the work. But yet, I really wasn't the teacher yet that they needed. But by the end of the semester, they were the teachers that I needed. And I started participating in their student club and learning from them. And eventually, now I can teach not only what I know, but also what they taught me as well. So it's kind of a multi-generational journey, and then I finally get deeper into LARP. But this goes back to the beginning of my journey away from, I don't want to say away from theater, okay? So I'm going to talk a little bit about what I now am focused on, interested in creating. So just a little bit about myself. It's a very loaded, as I thought if I just say this without putting it on a slide, I'll lose you at the very beginning. So theater, transmedia, immersive narrative, experience design, including game design, and location-based technology. But the core of what I'm doing comes together in thinking about what I call spatial storytelling or spatial narrative. So these are some of the things that I've been doing. It's also noted that I didn't even mention that I had a theater company in Philadelphia for over a decade doing adaptations. That was the beginning of transmedia, of going from books to theater. But that's in the background. So here I'm a professor of acting at the Conservatory of Theatre Arts at Purchase, where I was also the dean. I have a company in China, which has been fraught for the last few years to get going. We started it in 2016 and had a number of great projects, most of which got either halted or amended as COVID hit. And of course, it hit earlier there. I'm currently now at Fachhochschule, Salzburg. It's taken me a while to learn how to say that, where I just finished teaching, well, I have 2 more classes next week, where I finish teaching next week, and I come back in the spring as a Fulbright professor, teaching immersive narrative and game design. And this is the 3rd year of my working with the United Nations, building youth activation hubs in 10 cities using transmedia storytelling, immersive storytelling, and game design, where the students or the graduates and postgraduates who are telling stories, building communities in the different cities using the techniques that I'm teaching them, that leads to a festival in each of the 10 cities, that leads to a nationwide hackathon where they actually present plans for climate change activities or water scarcity issues. They're also learning, but it's social. It's a social activation at its core. It's about building enthusiasm and motivation and friendships between both Kurds and Arabs, and also between generations. So they're working with younger children, building projects in schools, also using games, also using storytelling. So they're, as I always say to them, they're going from their head to the heart, and from the heart to the next generation, and this is very appealing to the older generation, and now the government is beginning to support it. So the pretext of what Iraq is, especially to a US citizen, has a filter which is actually not the reality. It's actually a young, growing, divergent, multiracial, multi-language, multinational democracy. So you don't often hear that in our media, whether it's in Europe or in the US, certainly not in the US. So when I tell people, yeah, we're going to Iraq, both here and in the US especially, what? You're doing games in Iraq? Yeah, how about you? What? So we're now beginning to, this year, if this year is successful, this is the 3rd year of it, we're actually beginning to document it, and we're going to make this a model that may go to other regions. Okay, so back to the core. So moving from theater to immersive theater to Larp to new mediums of storytelling using creative technology. This journey is a personal journey, but I think it's also the journey that a lot of creatives are engaged in right now. And it's confusing because we still think of what we do within the mediums that we work. So theater people, I mean, theater is ridiculous. It calls itself theater, which is the name of a space, right? Larp, it's beyond me to ever understand one definition of Larp because everyone has a very different one. And sometimes it's locked into genre, sometimes it's locked into location, sometimes it's a design principle, but there is a feeling within it that is extraordinary, and that happens in theater as well, but there's a challenge in both. And then creative technology, certainly many people in theater and in Larp are allergic to the whole notion of technology, creative or not. So what I thought I would do is not try to be an antidote to the bias questions between mediums, but just show you how I think about it, and then perhaps provoke you into thinking that I'm mad crazy, or thinking that I might have a point, or somewhere in the middle. So the first issue is staging the story, okay? Now, the question of staging in the theater is it's generally a very rigorous process based on a set space, usually a proscenium, a square. And in an immersive theater, it begins to expand, And in a virtual reality space, it needs to be designed. Portals need to be created. And in a LARP, in a similar way, what is the space? What are the affordance of doors, windows? This room is big, this room is small, we'll do this here, we'll do this there. You begin to sort of use the space as the pretext for the staging. So, but theater spaces, generally, so I have to say generally because there's experimental theater which says that what I'm saying is, you know, foolish. So theater spaces generally are contained spaces, an alternate reality zone where there is something happening in an alternate reality that we can sit in our chair and look in, straight on, like what I call frontal. And LARPs, by the comparison, are in an open 360 world setting. Now, the 360 world setting may be confined by a castle, might be confined by a glen or the forest. So theater staging, by comparison with LARP uses more improvisation and role play. There's role play in theater and improvisation in theater, but then it gets codified because of language, which I'll talk about in a minute. Okay. So experiences of both storytelling and story living. And now we begin to sort of see how the threads get pulled apart with the word story. So scripted text, generally theater. My questions are, what does fixed dialogue script offer? I'm going to talk about that more in the workshop later, but if you have a fixed point, such as a line or a word, the time it's possible to go deeper into the character because of theater's process of rehearsal and repetition means that it's not spontaneous, it's not in the moment, but it has a fixed point in the language, and when an actor pivots between those lines to be said, and the audience does too. You may be, the best productions of, say, Doll's House, should not be clear how it's going to end. In fact, if it's clear that it's going to end with her leaving in the first 2 acts, why must you sit there, right? But many theater productions telegraph the ending because they know it and they want to let you know that they know it, instead of giving you an experience of the story where you can discover it moment by moment. For me, one of the best productions of it is actually an old television version of it with Christopher Plummer and Julie Harris, in which they play the two of them as such wonderful friends, equal kind of sibling relationship, that when it turns, it's a tragedy for both of them that this relationship ends. Stunning piece of interpretation, but it actually shows you that the language can sometimes be an experience to be with if the production team, the actors, the director knows that you're building in time a story. So the benefit of script writing and an author's character development is a boost. Every LARP that I've participated in, the question of how well have you been onboarded, and have you been onboarded too much or too little, and the role of enthusiasm of the player varies between the beginner and the experienced LARPer, and every LARP has hot and cold water places in the experience, whereas a script, it's defined, and you go back in and rehearse and rehearse. A director's rehearsal schedule looks at scenes, sometimes out of order. The best rehearsals are out of order where you can just focus on 5 pages or 1 page or a paragraph and find and plumb its depths. And the script gives you the ability to go back in and find new and new and new, and then the challenge is, can the performance be as good as was the rehearsal? And memorization. Okay, memorization is the terror of theater, right? Anyone who has not acted says, how do you remember all those words? And the people in the theater go, oh, well, it's easy, whatever. They lie. The reason it's hard is not necessarily that committing it to memory. The reason that it's difficult is that it begins to bleach, like coral reef, the life in what was happening in the rehearsal. So if you can get the actors to work book in hand, as we say, and they can not know where they are and find something new because they said the wrong word, and you hear the wrong word because you're not looking at your book too. That early process of rehearsal is probably the most beautiful thing that there is. And then comes the dark age, when they begin to try to be off book today. And that period of time is kind of a torture. And you're homesick for the week before, when you were all loving the process and the play and each other, and the break was always an interruption, and now the break is like a relief, But the memorization gives you something extraordinary, because once it's past, once they kind of know it, even if they sort of kind of know it, no, they have to know it, to the word, to the pause, then they can relax. They can go back to that improvisation, but now what they say is what the writer wrote, right? And not only that, but the time it takes to reply. What you do, you say something to me, and I decide to pour another cup of coffee while I think about what you're going to say back. That choice is moored, it's anchored in the fact that there is a next line. So making the time, breaking the time. Oh, I'm falling in love with theater all over again, just I've been thinking about this. But then comes this other terrible period, another dark age. The tech happens. And then the tech happens, and then the process of the repetition without an audience, because you are no longer, you have not been fired as the director, but you have been by the actors. They really now no longer want you, your laughter, your notes. They are waiting for the eternal part of them to come clear, to quote, with an audience. And lo and behold, the worst thing you can have happen is be ready too long before an audience shows up. So sometimes the rehearsal process needs to account for, be in a hurry to get to a great place by the time it opens, but not too much before it opens. So the time is like cooking, right? You take it out too soon or too late, both are bad, right? So I was once directing a production of Oscar Wilde's Lady Windermere's Fan, and I was like geared up, a lot of language, a lot of actions, a lot of costumes, a lot of space, a lot of temporal design. He does amazing things with time and time passing. Brilliant writer. Far beyond his wit. He's a master craftsman. I got done too soon. I got done a week early. Costumes were done, tech was done, and we still had a week. Thank God Lady Windermere got a terrible flu. So no more, we couldn't run, so I worked on little pieces in and around, and by the time she got healthy enough to come back on stage, we had a show. And I was like, so sometimes we have to strategically think about the timing. So these issues in theater are all based on there being a script as opposed to improvisation. We use improvisational techniques. In fact, before I really understood Larp, I was actually using techniques from improvisation that are very similar to what happens in Larp. So I was directing a play called Tales from the Vienna Woods, a Van Horvath play, and there's a lot of scenes that happen off stage and relationships that are not worked out in the script. So I would just say, to a couple who are kind of an odd relationship, they have no really scenes together, I'm going to set up your living room. I'm going to have some music that you can play. I'm going to have some food for you to eat and magazines. And I'm just going to leave you be. I gave them no other notes. 10 minutes in, they didn't know what to do. 15 minutes in, they were beginning to stir. By a half an hour, it was essentially a Larp, right? And then by an hour, I was like, okay, let's go pick up the scripts, not talk about it, just go into the scripts, and the relationship was there, because they had lived it. I also threw a block party and brought all this wonderful, Viennese German food, and I cooked for them, and I said, okay, block party, in character, in the rehearsal room, you have an hour. And suddenly, life was happening, and the show was never stiff. It was scripted, but it was alive, because they were finding that space. Okay, so improvisation versus the scripted text. So here the Larper takes ownership of the character within their ownership of the story world, something that actors do infrequently. And directors don't introduce hardly enough. From narrative elements produced by the Larp writers. So there also are writers in Larp too, but the writers in Larp are setting character elements. They're setting location meanings. They're setting mythologies. So the whole development of what we call the story world, as opposed to the story, which I'll get into in a second, is a very different thing. And the Larper directly has participation in that. Now, it is also true that some actors work through the imagination and they need to know that, but many actors default to learning their character and learning their lines and understanding their relationships and what other characters say about them. So they're living in a private psychological story world of its own within all the other story worlds, and the thing becomes, I don't know, it's kind of chaotic to manage. It's more like packing a ship with different agendas rather than setting sail as a crew, which I think is more a better image for LARP versus theater. So a rich LARP also offers a 360 embrace of the space and the spatial narrative. The participants' creative inventiveness in LARP builds the narrative and creates immediacy among players. This can happen in theater, but the hierarchy in theater, where there's a director in setting the agenda, and where actors are not evolving through running, and it's also so short. We're shooting to sort of land, you know, a helicopter on a Dixie cup, right? Instead of trying to sort of like explore an entire territory. And the immediacy among players creates something new, something you could not have expected if you came from theater. Like I came from theater, I did not expect the richness of the character relationships and the relationship to the whole field of play and the space. The space was extraordinary impact, unlike anything I'd ever experienced in theater, where we're trying to put everything in a box. Okay, so this is this concept I want to play with, story versus story world. So a story is contained and shaped by a medium. If it's a story in a theater, it's a certain kind of story. If it's a story in a game, it's another kind of story. If it's a story in an app, if it's a story as a mystery box, if the story is other mediums, an audio piece, a walk, a podcast, like each of these pieces are small enough that it's really one story. But the story world is that whole alternate reality where collaborators build and combine different narrative elements. So a LARP writer is actually building a story world and enabling play within that world. Whereas a playwright is telling a story that implies a story world. And the difference is critical. So theater brings you a story. LARP brings you into a story world. That's not to say that there are not stories in LARP, but stories don't work well in LARP. It's not the best thing about LARP. If you're strongly telling a story in a LARP, I kind of think you're doing a play, right? And if there is a story world to be explored in a theater piece, and a lot of immersive theater pieces try to do this, you're kind of on the edge of LARP. Why not just cross over and make it a LARP, right? Because like immersive theater is a kind of, it's a kind of a changeling, right? It's neither nor. Nobody knows who gave birth to it. Nobody knows what its destiny is. Is it human? Is it not human? And yet, it sits in between. Invisibly, in invisible ink, I wrote immersive theater in the middle, right? Okay, so a story world concept can expand to many mediums. Okay, here we go. Now we're into magic circles, into the realm of possibilities. So if a story world is the thing we want to focus on, not theater, not LARP, but story world, we can feed everybody, right? And forever. if you want such a big story world. That takes a big budget. But the story world can be generated from space, from characters, from objects, from mythology. I'll talk about more of what goes into a story world in a second. But it's enormous, right? And it's ever growing. And whoever enters the story world can add to it, right? And it could be multiple mediums. That's where transmedia begins to sort of be a logical extension of that. The story concept, as opposed, this is the last time I'll say story, the story concept struggles to be adapted and often into other mediums. Think about the books that became lousy films, or the films that came from lousy books, right? Like, there's something about the transition between, in the whole world of what we call, before we got to this great world that we are in now, that word adaptation, right? So, had a theater company years ago. It was about adaptation, novel stages. You can see how challenging that was, right? Oh, it was worse. Novel Stages was not only a theater company dedicated to building work from mediums that were not originally theater. That was the feather in our cap. But also working with visual artists who had never designed for the theater. We were right in the forefront of the howitzer called reality. Because the people who'd read the books were disappointed in the shows. And the people who didn't know, who saw the plays, thought they should have read the books. So everyone left sort of sad. But that's the reality of stories. But if you're in that zone where you're thinking about adaptation and you're not embracing the story world, you're done, right? Okay, so I'm going to go into a deeper definition of story world. So it's a shared universe within which the settings, characters, objects, events, and actions of many narratives can be generated in multiple mediums. All right? Now, if you think about, if I take away the word generated in the phrase generated in multiple mediums, that's not a bad definition of LARP, is it? Okay? But now, since you've got 2 sentences, why not add the next, 4 words? It's possible because you're already interested in story world. You're already interested in the ways that you can co-create in a story world. So, extending narratives beyond the stage. So, story world possibilities. Creative technology, the expansion of LARP into virtual and augmented reality, location-based narratives, and real-world situations. It doesn't get called LARP, right? But we know who the parent is, right? We know who the parent is. Edu-LARP and social change, exploration of how LARP can reshape public relationships with power and revitalize communities. We should be calling it LARP, or we should be calling it LARP influence. Edu-LARP, okay, has the word in it, but very often Edu-LARP doesn't call itself that because it seems like an adaptation, and we know about adaptations. But social change, education. All right, side note, I'm a professor in a university. I am also a theater, an artist. When I started out, I thought, oh, I'll start teaching, because that's solid, to support my art, which is fragile. It turns out to be the reverse, right? So art and creativity, especially moving across mediums, is very vital, very strong. It's partly why people who can talk across these things get a lot of attention, because the arts are suddenly being attracted, or people are attracted to it because everything else is failing, right? Education as an institution, clay feet, right? It's on, little pins. How many, institutions of education are completely not serving their students, still requiring papers, still requiring books, still asking them to do things that, of course, the AI are going to be able to give them a low-level ability to do. So, how do you grade? How do you measure? How do you evaluate, even in the old model? And better still, how do you think about the world they're going to, right? So it's 2023, and most people who are teaching will probably be no longer with us by 2040, 50. Oh, wow, I said that. But the people who they're teaching, they have like a good part of the rest of this century to live. And look what happened to us the last 10 years. Now, you can't perfectly anticipate it, but you can begin to get them to do something which education does not do. Get them to work together. Work them to be in groups, facilitate their shared knowledge, because even though they all might be ignorant on lots, there are things that happen in the group that do not happen if you tell them what they need to know. And this goes true to theater, too. When you're directing a play and you don't have an ensemble that is active and vital and teaching and building their own work together, you have the power of one brain, and probably a brain that's insecure that the power will be taken with them, because that's what theater directors are often like. Even the best of them are like threatened. There's an actor who's actually telling other actors what they should do with a scene, right? It's a terrible thing. It wasn't true in the theater 150 years ago. It's true today because we have this hegemony, we have this hierarchy within institutions, not only in theater, but also vastly in education. I had a teacher in new media. We still call it new media at my university, which is crazy because the program hasn't changed in like 15 years. I was like, aren't you ashamed? So he said to me, and he's like one of the more progressive faculty members. He's one of the leaders of diversity in the campus. He's a very strong gay advocate, gay man. It's like, he's cool. He's absolutely... And he said, David, why are they working so hard on your classes and not ours? I was like, what are you doing? What's the secret? So I thought, let me start with, are you using Discord, right? Are you facilitating group work? No, what's that? Okay, so is that... So I say, all right, I'm sitting at him with lunch and we're in a cafe shop, and I say, okay, here's my phone. Look through the Discord channels. Every class is in Discord. Look at the activity. What's this off-topic channel? It's a social space. They can share stuff, right? But it's not serious. I was like, no, but it means that there's something that makes them pick up their phone and let notifications be part of it, right? How much of the class happens in class? Oh, about a third of it. Most of it happens in between class. How often do they have to sit in a classroom? They can use the lawn, they can go outside, they can go have a coffee together. They'll work because I know I can watch it in Discord. like all day long, all night, bing, ding, ding, And sometimes, if I'm free, at 11 o'clock at night, there's a question in the channel with my name attached to it. I'll answer it. I'll join a voice. That kind of participation is a social. It's like we're doing this thing together. And like I described earlier, the students who taught me about Larp, or introduced me to Larp, I should say, it still goes on. If I have a student who doesn't like the class, I had this one guy, Mikey, tall guy, long hair, black fingernail polish, trench coat. Sat through most of the class, probably is at this conference. So he would sit in the back of the class and look at me, and I thought, oh, he hates me. He so hates me. And so one day, he was slow packing up his stuff, and I sat with him, and I was like, you hate this class, don't you? And he said, yeah, I do. I was like, okay, tell me why. And he was like, all these pretty valid, serious reasons. And it was towards the end of the semester. I should have grabbed him earlier. But I said, next semester, I'd like you to be my teaching assistant. Shocked. He was one of the best damn teaching assistants I ever had. And the class changed tremendously because of it. And he changed a little bit too. He changed a little bit too. Probably at least equal. Okay, so The social change, the use of creative technology, these are not only extensions of this idea of the story world, which, as I said, with Larp, you're in already, right? You know, you're wading in it, right? So if you were to move into areas of thinking about how technology would work, make sure you don't do the evil stuff. And social change, your heart's kind of in there anyway, right? The feeling and the enthusiasm that you have. So why not build a project in Iraq? Why not do something in a community? Why not reach out? And because everyone, if you think of everyone in education, they're all landlocked on these islands. They don't know how to get off of. Okay, so the other thing about Larp that I love, that overtakes my original love, is the we versus I story dynamic. So all of most theater plays are about identity, not we-dentity, right? And Larp is aligned with our current culture of interaction and immersion, right? You know what we call in the US the grassroots. Like, it's the roots. And oh, am I on theme? I'm on theme, aren't I? Right? No, I'm on vines. No, so from the roots, we go to the vines. Okay. All right, so let me talk about, all right, so spatial narratives. I said that earlier, and nobody challenged me, but it's a question. What does that mean? So spatial narrative is encountered rather than explained. It is experienced through enhanced locations. Memory is spatial. Dreams are spatial. We remember by spaces, we imagine through spaces, and we understand our bodies through spaces. Okay? So character and dialogue is secondary to the space. Where you choose to live, where you choose to travel, where you are, where you decide to throw that party or go out for a beer, all of those spaces are at least co-creating with you, if not actually reframing it. Not containing it, but reframing it. So this is when I work with students on spatial design, I give them this template. I know it's kind of small. I'll read it quickly through. So 1, architecture, landscape. 2, music, sound. 3, atmosphere, scent, mist. 4, visual. 5, lighting. 6, rituals. I took a shift there, right, at 6. 6, rituals. 7, games. 8, stories. 9, new shift. Time, tempo. 10, intensity levels. 11, types of interactions. 12, immersion. 13, triggers in the 5 senses. And lastly, significance and values, which can be symbolic or they can be thematic. None of these are story, but all of these are how you enhance a space. The first 5 are much more scenic, right? Setting, from smell to sound to sight. The next 3 are much more human, culture, right? The field of the anthropologist, really. Rituals, games, stories. The last group, the last 6 are 5. The last 5 are experience design, right? How do we use time? What's the duration? What levels of intensity? What kinds of interactions? What's the breadth and scope of what is available in that story world? Immersion, how deep, how not deep, floaters, swimmers, divers. Triggers, the triggers can be senses, but they can also be words, right? And that also then aligns next with the next thing, which is significance and values. If you were to design a space just using all of these, what would that space be? No story, no location. So I have students work with the 5 universal shapes. I get to that. Do I get to that later? I get to that later. I'll show you that later. So the ground, this is from the visual arts. We always talk about in the visual arts the figure ground. So the character is the chalice, and the 2 faces are the ground. And we can actually see both at the same time, and our mind toggles between the 2. They are equal in that neither one has precedence or priority. So in this way, the space, or the setting, are the 2 faces, and the characters are the chalice. So that's how important I would recommend thinking about the spatial design. So narrative shape, and here I get to the spaces, the shapes. So I play a lot with these 5 universal shapes. So the circle, which is a narrative shape of stories that end as they began. Nesting tales, stories within stories, like Scheherazade. A lot of Persian stories are that such. The triangle, our hero's journey. It's one of 5, everybody. It's one of 5. And it's generally more useful when you are good at telling stories in the medium that you're doing, which is not really LARP, right? Film, theater, novels can do better with the hero's journey because beginning, middle, and end follow the main person, right? Rising action, falling action, denouement, like we learned in school. And spiral, which I'm going to focus on the most, is the immersive narrative, and cross, the branch narrative. So of these, the triangle is the least go-to for a story world design. Okay, and a little bit more. I guess this is exactly kind of what I said, but laid out slightly differently. Oh, no, it talks about spaces. So the sphere or the dome, if you want to do the space, the cube and the pyramid, the labyrinth, and the intersection. So these are markers for types of spaces. They could be in the space that you're using, or they could be like we're using today with vines. It's a template for storytelling, right? That isn't strictly to any one specific narrative. It's themed. So a little bit on the branch narrative. That's a story that expands outward with extensions that offer audiences and players choices. This one is largely used in, well, it certainly goes back to ergodic literature where writers and paper, writing in paper, right, could actually create these branches and different stories, right? Stories that didn't have the right order of beginning, middle, and end. And then we saw with the era of hypertext and the digital book, this took off. But also the internet is essentially a branch narrative. And just think about how problematic, I'm going to say more to the theater maker, to tell a story that is in the triangle when you have people working every day in their lives in the branch narrative, hopping from link to link to link to link. You know, what we sometimes call, well, we sometimes are wasting time on certain social medias, but even when we're wasting time, we're traveling in the branches or the vines. Open world, which is where the narrative is discovered in a space with narrative elements widely distributed. Immersive theater tries to use this. The problem is every time you land on an immersive element, a narrative element, it kind of becomes a little mini story and it becomes repetitive after a while because it's all being delivered to you frontally even though you're experiencing it kind of spatially. And then the nonlinear narrative, which has an internal logic but not a sequential chronological, right? And that's something that can be used in games, that can be used in Larps, that can be used in lots of different storytelling. So the idea of a nonlinear narrative is not connected to one medium. I mean, all of these are possibly usable in multiple mediums. So if you think of the space, and you think of the medium, and then you think of the narrative design, they're all kind of separate filters and questions of what you're looking at. So lastly, I just want to land on the labyrinth. So the labyrinth and the maze, I don't know, I learned this, so I figured not everyone knows it. The labyrinth and the maze are two different things. The maze is where you're being challenged to find the way in, and you're being blocked, you think it's this way, and it's not. The labyrinth is not that. The labyrinth is a path that you don't lose yourself, you find yourself. In the labyrinth, you don't necessarily encounter the Minotaur, but you might. But in the labyrinth, you always encounter yourself. And this speaks to the greatest thing I love about Larp, which is that all of the patterns and all of the stories lead you to yourself, and then yourself back out. So this is why the labyrinth design, I think, is the most immersive. And you see the walkway in this hedge, you actually know, you not only cross the 7 rings in the classic labyrinth, there are 7 rings, you cross the 7 rings to the center, and then you walk another 7 rings out. You're crossing back around where you came. In other words, you retrace your step, which is not unlike what happens in life, right? You spend the first half of your life making choices, and the second half of your life revisiting those choices and perhaps with wisdom. So it's not about the end, you got to the center like it would be in the triangle, but it's actually about finding a place and then winding out of that place, but differently. Okay, and it's the way we think about our lives, forward and backward. It also restores our equilibrium and balance, helps us reconnect our mind with our body and with our spirit. That's the labyrinth at Chartres Cathedral. This is one from Baroque painting, I believe. And this is an old tile. The labyrinth as a design is all over the world. There's no one country or region. The Hopi Indians had it. Clearly the Greeks had it. It also shows up in Asia as well. So it's a template for a magic circle or a sacred space. It's a place where the two worlds flow together, the visible and the invisible, the finite and the infinite. And that's the potential of a brilliantly designed story world. It's not only something that is a co-experience, but it's also something that can deeply touch you in a way. And that's why so much of what happens at the end of the great Larps is that you don't leave it. It doesn't happen in theater. Sometimes a theater actor can have a while getting rid of the character and maybe never forget them. But the experiences that you're creating and facilitating and having, this is partly, I think, why they're so powerful. It opens us to an experience like the labyrinth that if we followed holding a thread, and the other thing about the labyrinth I always forget to say, it's not about the walls of the labyrinth. It's about the thread that you carry through. In fact, it's about the passageway that's created, not the design, not the drone's view, not the images that I showed you where you see the whole thing. But when you're in a labyrinth, you only know the path and the way. Or if you're Theseus, it's the thread that you're carrying that takes you to the center, or the deeper core of meaning. And retracing our way out, seeing again which confused us. Okay, and my last slide is one of my favorite quotes. All tales are at some level a journey into the woods to find the missing part of us, to retrieve it and make ourselves whole. Okay, thank you. If we're on schedule, I have 3 minutes, but if we eat into someone else's, we have maybe 10. Questions, thoughts?
There's time for questions.
Yeah, there's time.
Everybody's mind blown.
Yes.
Yes. We need like a couple of minutes to digest it.
Yeah.